The changing political climate, better known as what happens to the rest of the world after World War II. Learning Target 4 focuses on the explanation of how the Cold War shaped the global geopolitical climate, which included the various proxy wars and non-aligned movements after World War II. The purpose of this PowerPoint is to give you some insight into those various issues. As many of you know, the Cold War began at the end of World War II in 1945. During the Cold War, you have the pitting of the new superpowers of the United States versus the Soviet Union against each other. A superpower is defined as a nation that is strong enough to influence the acts and policies of other nations. And certainly these countries will attempt to do that with the various new countries that are formed after World War II. Ultimately, a struggle for the ideological superiority of their beliefs over other nations will encompass the majority of the Cold War issues. The ending of World War II will allow numerous colonial holdings to gain their independence and freedom and to form their own nations. Between 1950 and 1980 alone, over 50 new nations emerge in Africa. Why does this change occur? Let's look at it on the next slide. As early as the 1930s, there was a growth of nationalism in the various colonies. When the outbreak of war happens, many of these imperial empires can no longer control their colonial holdings. Once the war is over, their economies in some situations are in shambles. They no longer have the political structure to maintain control of colonies, and the colonies are essentially allowed to have freedom or go by the wayside. The impact of the Cold War is going to be most significant in these newly emerged nations. The U.S. will support the idea of self-determination for nations, which means that they should be essentially their own boss. The Soviet Union also condemned the idea of imperialism. Although not fully in support of self-determination, they are in support of the idea of colonies becoming their own independent group. Unfortunately, these two groups will pit themselves against each other and use the countries as essentially a tool to try to gain different strongholds in the world. Thus, the competition begins for the ideology of these countries. Over the decades after World War II, nearly 90 new countries will emerge. This is known as a period of the Great Liberation because so many of these countries were former colonial holdings of different imperial empires. These new nations are referred to as, quote, developing nations or as third world nations. During the Cold War, the term third world was used to actually refer to these nations that had less advanced technology than that of the first world, which would be the Western industrial powers in Japan, or the second world, which would be the communist bloc nations. This map shows you in really a better light the countries included in these three different tiers. Nowadays, we tend to refer to many of these countries as developing nations. It's a more politically correct statement, although, to be honest, quite a few people still say third world nations. It won't take long in the new Cold War era for the superpowers to start to influence new nations. There becomes a competition between the United States and our capitalist belief system versus the Soviet Union and the socialist belief structure to try to persuade these developing nations to choose either capitalism or socialism. Some of these nations chose to view themselves as non-aligned nations, which means that they wanted to avoid the superpower rivalry and basically remain non-aligned or neutral, essentially not aligned with the U.S. or the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, there will be conflicts erupting in Africa, Latin America, and Asia that will begin to take on different Cold War dimensions, and you will start to see the influence of the United States or the Soviet Union in these conflicts, even if neither power has direct military support on the ground. A proxy war or proxy warfare is a war that results when opposing powers use third parties as substitutes for fighting each other directly. So, in the list that you see below, in the Cold War proxy wars, you would have the United States versus the Soviet Union essentially using other people to fight a battle. So, for example, in the Korean War, you had the Soviet Union supporting the North Korean Communist forces, and of course the United States supporting South Korea and the more democratic forces. We eventually obviously put troops on the ground, and the Soviets do to some extent. But initially, that war happens when we support our side with military equipment and money, and the Soviets do the same. Hence, it was a proxy war. Below, you see a list of just a small selection of the many Cold War proxy wars. There's quite a few more. There's also been proxy wars since then that aren't technically labeled as Cold War proxy wars. The Cold War abruptly ends in 1991 with the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. Ultimately, what happens with the rest of the world as a result of this is that all those proxy wars that had existed left quite a bit of tensions in these various nations. Now you have people that perhaps had fought for one side are now trying to fight for control of a country that has gained either new independence or kind of been left in the lurch without Soviet control. Prime example of this would be in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen and the influence of the Taliban coming in. We see this pattern over and over again. Unfortunately, many of these countries will also see a rise of military or authoritarian leaders who ultimately become dictators. The list you see below, in most intents and purposes, not good guys. And some of you may be choosing to look at them more for your proxy war assignment. Unfortunately, these individuals, similar to Hitler, were allowed to come into power because their countries were economically and politically vulnerable, and these guys had the good ideas, and they had the charisma and the speech-making abilities to really inspire people, or they had the support of the military to either lead a successful coup or to basically rise to the top. And oftentimes in these countries, it's not until these individuals were fully in control that the citizens start to realize that they now essentially have a dictator in place, and their life as they know it has forever changed. Currently, these nations are dealing with a variety of issues, whether it be fully identifying their political ideology, meaning are they socialist, capitalist, democratic, republican, a wealth of different political groups. What is their leadership like? They'd have to deal with terrorism and many different factions. Sometimes terrorists are the groups fighting for control of the country. Economics plays a huge part, particularly in these developing nations. Are they going to be able to survive on a global scale? There's human rights violations. The 1948 Declaration of Human Rights certainly tried to address some of these issues, but it's an ongoing concern. Some of these countries are increasing their level of deadly weapons potential, like Iran, for example, and nuclear proliferation. And then, of course, there's the issue of globalization. Where do these somewhat newly emerged or developing countries fit into the rest of the global spectrum, and are they still relevant on a global scale? The Non-Aligned Movement is essentially a collection of 115 member nations that focus on the interests and priorities of developing countries. It has its origin in Indonesia in 1955, and as you see to the right, has included such notable members as Nehru, Nasser, and Tito. They do have an official website. They are still actually an official organization. They last met in Tehran in August of 2012. And I did include the website there at the bottom for you to look at them a little bit further, as somebody might want to do a product based off of this group. But they basically focus on the interests of developing nations, and that includes probably a surprising collection of countries if you were to look at the list. So after viewing this PowerPoint, your task now is to answer the following questions. You may do this on a piece of paper, so to speak, on Notability, and submit it. If you cannot answer these questions based on the PowerPoint, there's additional information on page 806 in your textbook.